then a
Cultural Manager with Willoughby Council. I'd like to thank you very much for coming along this evening. The Symposium, Beyond the Face of Public Art, will try to tease out the varying relationships, or not, between the private art practice of the artists here and their public art practice, which we've been very lucky to enjoy through the public art policy. The Willoughby City Council's public art policy creates work for public spaces, both the council's public spaces, but also through our development application process, through some of the private or the public spaces of private developments. We'd like to particularly thank Mirvac, who have been have very much engaged these processes, and some of their works you will see later on in the next couple of days. So the catalogue you have on your chair is the work, or are the works that we're going to be talking about tonight. So some of them, the small ones, are the works that are actually in our public spaces, and the others are the works that you will later on see down in the gallery. We're welcome that you ask questions tonight, but because we're recording it, just for our local YouTube, don't get too excited, but we want you to stand up and speak clearly. So I'd now like to introduce you to the panel. First of all, we have Fenella Kernebone, an art journalist who's going to be chairing the evening this evening, followed by Warren Langley, Richard Goodwin, Pamela See, Andy Townsend, Suzie Bleach, Wendy Mills, Fong, and L.M. Noonan, or Loretta Noonan. So without further ado, you're also all very much invited downstairs afterwards for the opening. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome. I know we've already spoken to you, but now we are talking to you for real. As Jackie said, and thank you very much, Jackie, for your introduction, my name is Fenella Kernebone, and I'm very pleased to be here and to talk to these very long panel of fabulous artists. So, and as Jackie said, this is a great opportunity for you to ask questions as well about what you love about their work and about their private versus their public practice. So, first of all, I think we should give them a round of applause because they're all here this evening, so thank our artists. Richard, Wendy, Warren, Pamela, Fong, Loretta, Suzie and Andy. Got that right? In that order. Let's begin. Let's do something quite simple by opening up the discussion and just talking a bit about the differences between your public and your private practice. So Warren, you're on my left. You say that your public and your private practice is inseparable. Explain that for me.
It's becoming less inseparable as I get older. There was a period when everything I did informed everything else that I did. Increasingly I find that I'm becoming more and more interested in just purely responding to sight. And it's a rather seductive indulgence. And I think for me now it's just a response to sight. Gets me excited.
Okay. Who else has that kind of precise response to sight? Richard, is it the same for you when it comes to your public practice versus what you do for the private world?
It's slightly different. I operate at 3 scale, so I use the gallery and the studio as a laboratory for work that looks at where the body ends and architecture begins, so it's about prosthetics. At the scale of architecture in the city, I use buildings as bodies and prostheticize parasitic architecture, and I convert that in my urban work to ideas about where those parasites might go. I call that porosity, the extension of public space. So the scales, because they're very different, the devices and the ideas in the work are the same, but they change at different scales. So you'll see I have a boat down there, which is my interest in prosthetics. I get an old exoskeleton for the body, I do something with it. It's really looking at the insect quality of humanity and how you can we make a sort of a bodybuilding when we marry with a car or we marry with a boat. Yeah, so that's, but when it comes to the work, say, on the Griffin Gallery, the prostheticization is different. So the language must change. It's outside of the gallery. And here I play a game with Walter Burley Griffin, who I greatly admired as I'm an architect as well as an artist. And so we had a situation where for that new museum in Willoughby to operate, there had to be a lift, a horrible lump sticking out of the landscape. So I played with Griffin's 30, 60-degree angle triangles, built it into my computers, and then morphed in parametrically the shape. So it's a conversation about geometry with Walter Elder Griffin, and it forms an exoskeletal skin. So it's still the same philosophy as the exoskeleton in the gallery, but it takes on perhaps different forms in public space.
Okay, maybe I might go down to the end and change it up a bit. Loretta, for you, what's the difference between your private and your public practice? I know that you describe what you do as basically private's about making work just for yourself. So tell me about that.
I'm not a very social artist, and I find it very difficult normally to collaborate with anybody in any sort of degree. So my private work is really just that. I really don't care what anybody thinks about it while I'm making it. Of course, I care if it goes out there deeply, and it's much more ephemerally based, and it's just about what's at hand, and about just trying to wrest something, some meaning, some form out of those kind of disparate items that I might have in my studio at any one time. Working in the public arena is different. I think I'm probably different to almost every artist here in that I collaborate with Fong. And that, besides having to collaborate and work out all the problems that two different types of artists have, and we also are married, so that makes it very hard. I can't go home slang off about him or anything, he's there.
So you wake up in the morning, bedtime talk is art, nighttime talk is art.
Yeah, it gets...
This is good.
Well, it is, and it has its merits. But the other thing is that making public art drags me screaming back into the real world, and it forces me to think about lots of things. Like if someone says to me, well, what's the value of art? And then I sort of think, well, all you have to do is think about a world without art. Art surrounds us, and if you took that away, that's the best way for me to describe it. So I'm forced into that, and I'm forced into thinking about what's going to go out there and the responsibility I have towards the people who are going to be up and bumping up against it and so on.
So Fong, to follow on from Loretta, how then do you collaborate in that moment for what has to be seen by the rest of us? What's that conversation like? Don't give us the dirty stuff.
No, I shan't, that's private. I suppose public art has limitations, and it is usually site specific. So we collaborate in the sense that how does she define that public space, and how do I define that public space, and we can try and see if there's a common thread between how we perceive what's appropriate for what site. Look, there's definitely more freedom in private works and studio works, and sometimes I'm able to upscale to public for the public arena, but most of the times the limitations are quite difficult to overcome.
So when you're saying upscaling it, does that mean that you're using similar materials? The ideas are there, it's just on a larger scale?
Yes, and I suppose I would class myself as predominantly a stone sculptor, and although that's probably a bad thing to sort of categorize yourself, but yeah, I'm passionate about working with stone. I love the material. I work from a process of taking away, I suppose, subtraction as opposed to addition.
Okay. Wendy, maybe I could throw this one to you here now. The differences between public and private practice for you. Describe a bit about how that works in your practice.
Private and public are working together. And something was mentioned earlier, that working with the site, most of my work has been very site specific, and I spend a lot of time hanging out on that site if I can, photographing it. A lot of photography goes on in my process of finding information and becoming familiar with the site. And I think for probably everyone here, the process of actually coming up with that final idea for a public art piece, there's a lot of work that happens in between that initial information about the brief for it and what you finally make. In a way, I see that as more private practice because a lot of other work happens in that time before you end up with that final idea.
How important is it, just on that note, to remember that? It's funny, we always think about that final product, the outcome, but actually it's the making of the work, it's the ideas that is as important as you're saying, Wendy. Anybody, what do you think, Suzie?
Well,
Into the mic, sorry.
yeah. Well, for me, the private practice is all about freedom and having fun with no restrictions. You can do anything you like with any material that you like. In the public field, it's the constraints are enormous. It's will the work survive 10 drunks climbing on it? So materiality. But also, like Fong and Loretta, for me, private practice is just me, whereas public practice, I collaborate with my husband also, Andy Townsend.
And Andy, seeing as Loretta went first, this time you can go second. Suzie, sorry. How does that collaboration work between the two of you, particularly when it comes to the public work, and then maybe talk about your private work after that?
Suzie and I go through a process, I guess, where we talk to each other over a period of time, and we look at the site and we look at the brief, and we try to find some way or ways to insert the themes that we're interested in into the brief, to find some suitability or niche for them. And
what's an example?
What's an example of going through that process?
That you're talking about, where you try and insert your themes into the brief.
Well, I guess the horse up in Railway Street it's a theme. The horse theme is one that we're interested in, and we've been exploring for a few years now. And we looked at that brief, which didn't call for a horse sculpture. In fact, an abstract work seemed at the time to be one that was preferred. And I suppose we found a way to use the horse as a way to take the viewer's imagination back to the past, into the past, I suppose. Because horses were so commonplace in this urban terrain here at one time, and now it's something of an oddity or a novelty. If you walk up that street now and see the silhouette of a horse, it's rather bizarre.
It's really playful, isn't it? When you walk past it, it totally changes the street.
So we're attracted to projects that have briefs that allow us some way to apply our ideas, I suppose, rather than going out into completely new territory. That's what we're interested in.
Okay. And finally, Pamela See, what's the approach for you, your private practice diverging, or how does it inform your public art practice? Tell me a bit about what it is that happens there for you.
Oh yeah.
I think the two of them inform each other relatively closely. I mean, I should point out that a lot of people in this panel have talked about the constraints of working in public space. I actually really enjoy working in public art because I hate to say it, but I do like working with the committee and having that community engagement with councils that bring to you all these statistics and this report saying, this is what's really important to this sector in the community, and I can create artworks in response to that. I don't know if I'm kind of, feeling a bit like I'm selling out in that way, but I'm sorry. I just find working with these symbols and trying to represent these ideas and values in the community, really stimulating. at the same time, they can be stimulating in a way that perhaps is very positive to the people commissioning work. At the same time, I'll give you an example, and this isn't commissioned by a council, but when I was overseas a few years ago, I had a major commission from a large international shipping company, and I was in fact in Beijing for a number of months producing these sculptures for them. And while I was over there, I heard this news that one of their ships had run aground in Queensland, where I live, and spilt oil, in the vicinity of where I live. And it was kind of really this moment of, I don't know, I mean, it really challenges the way you think and feel, because obviously that's providing me an income, it's setting my practice in a way. And what happened after that, I started to produce an ongoing series now about our dependency on oil and so forth. So in that way, it's also informed it as well.
So you're talking about conflict, really. The client, working with a client and then feeling conflicted afterwards by what you're doing, and sometimes, working within those constraints can be great, but also it can be a bit terrifying depending on what the situation is.
Well, I mean, that's why it's private and public. I think when it's a public artwork and you're creating something for them, I keep that in mind, and I look at that kind of symbols. But when it's private, I have a grudge or something. It's partly why I'm really quite. Fenella asked me before about what I've been doing. I'm actually really kind of. I don't like having a website. I kind of keep my gallery work quite separate to the commission work, simply because it is not so kind of complementary. I don't know. I mean, how some of the corporations, that have been asking me to do work would feel if they had seen. If they were more aware of that on the side.
So you keep it secret?
It's discretion.
Okay. Does anybody else on the panel have a similar kind of, talking about public versus private, obviously when you're doing something in public, you're being paid, so you may sometimes have that, do you bow down to what the client wants, and then in private secretly say, haha, you're terrible, or something like that? What about Suzie for you?
I think we've been really fortunate. We've mainly had really good clients, and I think in part actually that's because of public art officers like Jackie Talbot, who actually do all the groundwork and do all that negotiation for you. So for us, if we have a problem with the client, we would generally go to the Jackie Talbots of the world and say, eek, help, and they navigate the path for you. So we've actually been quite fortunate.
Richard, in your view? Because you do quite large-scale works, there's a lot of stakeholders involved, and you do have to make it safe so that 10 drunks don't hurt themselves on those pointy ends.
It's quite clear to me. Marcel Duchamp stopped making art because he didn't believe that the resistance of the material, or he believed that the resistance of the material to the idea was not working. And frankly, I believe the opposite. Somehow the resistance is where the edge comes for me, or the ideas come to some extent. So you enter public space, you enter politics. And the process of getting your idea formed perfectly is extremely difficult, but it's part of chiseling away the rocks. And one person chisel away a rock, other people. So you enter politics, you enter this very difficult zone, but you must never fail your moral position. And also it's quite possible, I feel I've never compromised a design. So I say right from the beginning to the commissioners that they can criticise, or they can reject something, but they can never tell me what to do. I can go away and come up with another idea, or I can, But
so what happens if you do compromise a design? And feel free, by the way, anybody at any point to jump in. What happens if you do compromise a design? Do you therefore become... Okay.
Yeah, and I think,
please, Warren. That's a good point.
Look, I think it's implicit in public art that you are satisfying stakeholders. However, one of the great problems that I'm finding in a lot of public arts is the brief. These briefs that want you to address the indigenous population and the culture of the site, and what have you. Now, all of these things are well and good. However, the brief should simply be respond to the site, nothing more nor less. If the artist chooses to respond by addressing the cultural history of the site, that's well and good. But it's these prescriptive briefs that I think have destroyed a lot of wonderful artworks because people compromise to fit the brief.
Just a short thing there, because it's critical. I think it has to go further than that. In actual fact, these briefs are terrible when everyone's getting so historicist. And postmodernism gave us back the site in context as an engine for ideas. Artists should be able to choose whether they work with the engine of context to make an idea, or that they make work which makes context. So it's more than just, the choice should be the artist, whether or not they're contextual or whether or not they're actually making context. And again, in the end, the ability to say no is what powers the artist. I mean, you talk about freedom, your actual freedom is to say no. No one wants to be in there at Albert Speer. Well, someone else would have done it, and they're just huts and they're going to rebuild Berlin. You can't be Albert Speer in any way.
So let's bring, maybe Wendy, I could get your response here, because we're talking about stakeholders here. You know, when you change or compromise your work, Warren says it is not art. Hearing what Richard has to say, what do you think when working with those stakeholders, the clients, or when offered a brief? What's your view? Into the mic, sorry.
Yes. It's got to the point where you actually laugh when you read the brief of a lot of these projects, because they want the artwork to do everything, to be everything to everybody, and just sit within the budget and all the practical limitations of it.
You told me that you do something cheeky in order to get around this, and I want us to hear that story. I'm trying to get this out of you. Yeah, Wendy says that she lies to the client. Tell me more. Not Chatswood, of course, no.
No, I think you can present an idea and put a slant on it, so the client feels like they're being satisfied, their brief is being satisfied. I can't give you examples of where I'm.
It's a seduction.
It's a seduction.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, Suzie, you're nodding enthusiastically. Tell me from your experience.
Well, for Relic, Andy went to the presentation, not I, and the client had a pretty firm idea of what they wanted for that site, and it wasn't our work. And Andy arrived, I think, having sort of only had 3 hours sleep doing last-minute preparations, pretty sort of ratty looking, and
typical artist,
but with his lucky green shirt on,
Great shirt.
and started off slowly talking about the work and why it was, you know, the work for the site, and became more and more passionate about the work and what he was talking about, that I think he won the client over just with his enthusiastic passion. It certainly wasn't what they wanted at the beginning.
Oh, they didn't lie. Fong and Loretta, how do you approach this idea of the client? Because when you're working in private, you are your own client, but then when you have to either lie or suggest or do something differently, as people are saying here?
Well, I think before we were brought on board, or any of the artists brought on board, the clients would have done their research on this anyway, so they would know what type of works we do. So really, if they bring us on board, and it's really their fault if things go wrong.
Loretta, you obviously agree, yes.
I think the only time we will compromise is if it's health and safety, it's something to do with health and safety. You know? That is pretty important.
Yes, I agree. I think the only compromise that we try to make, when I say try, you know, life is very strange. Maybe retrospectively you look back and think maybe I did compromise more than what I initially set out to do. Health and safety and all those issues surrounding the durability and so forth of art do impact on the ultimate design and thing that's made. But at the end of the day, and we always remind ourselves, we say this to each other, forget about everything else. Just worry about, make a work that you won't want to drive a long way around when you're seeing it, you know, that you don't want anyone to know that you've done. It's really important because after, you know, the dust has settled, you've got this monumental pile of dung, you know.
That could
and,
be
and
the
you
work.
really, you know, you've got to think about that. It's not like in a gallery. It's up and it's down and it's gone, it's whisked away. So
It's there forever. Pamela, I know I didn't intend to have you last again on this idea. We'll swap it around next time. But I mean, you sort of already raised it somewhat with how you approach the client, and that you love to do that collaboration that is key to a lot of what it is that goes into your public practice. You describe what you do as a cultural custodialship. Is that right?
I can't believe I wrote that.
You did. I don't even know if custodialship is a word, but I like it. I've written it down.
You want me to explain?
Yeah, I think more in the case of, as everybody's saying, you know, approaching that brief, if it's a historical brief or something like that, dealing with a client. What's your approach?
Well, I think that you know, when I'm brought onto a project, I don't actually explain that I went to art school. I'm a visual artist, but I also walked away from that for a while, and I decided because I wanted to make a difference in the community. I didn't really think that being art in a gallery was going to do that, so I trained in public relations, and I started working on campaigns, and then I started to make money for companies to make people eat more and drink more, and, you know. And then I thought, oh, this is really not good. So then I went and I walked out one day. Literally, just got up and walked out, and my manager was yelling, "Well, get back to your desk." And then the phone rang, and they said, "Oh, look, someone said, look, I've got this art project." I didn't have anything else to do. I was just literally in the car park in my suit still. I said, "Okay, you know, I'll do your display in the middle of the mall at that time, which was giant." Roosters.
Roosters. Did you
Yeah.
say roosters?
Because rooster, this is the thing, like rooster for Chinese is a symbol for leadership, and at the same time, there was bird flu going on, so that rooster image became something much more significant. I think when we're talking about custodialship, it's sort of like, I guess that's sort of, you know, every symbol that we put up means something to certain people in the community. And I think that, you know, I would like to do something that help people feel like they have a greater sense of ownership to that space. At the same time, there's freedom with the client when they keep asking for these highly aesthetic artworks. Sometimes they don't really think that much about what that symbolism means, and you can put things in there. You know, it's like Michelangelo's The Ceiling has heaps of that kind of stuff. You know, in the Sistine Chapel, you go look. That's just historically artists do that. That's how they survive.
But do you drive that symbolism that you're talking about, or is it in the brief, I suppose?
A bit of both. I guess it helps that a lot of my work, I guess it's read to have a real multicultural kind of like theme behind it. Even though, I mean, my interest is in colonialism, so it's sort of like, you know, lately I've been looking at the Christmas Island red crab. You know, there's crabs. There's like 42 million red crabs that live on Christmas Island, and they're really fascinating because there are only that many crabs there because when European settlement came in, they killed off all the local rats, like the native rats. So there's an explosion of these creatures, and now everyone wants to preserve them because yellow ants have come on and they're starting to eat all the crabs. But you see, like this thing about sustainability. But that's just like a crab. So if a client comes to you and says, you know, I sometimes they're really sick, they say, I want to use this flower, or, you know, I want to use this kind of animal, or that kind of thing. There's not often this thought about what that means. It goes kind of two ways, or you get that really, the other side of this brief about, I want you to symbolize this, this, and this, and this. But there's always, I find there's always room as an artist to work within that, to bring something of yourself.
Do you see what you do as placemaking?
I guess so. I mean, like the project we've just done with the tunnel, I worked in a sight link tunnel just down the road from here. What we did was, there were a number of flowers that we used that were actually featured in the landscape architecture's brief. What was important to me, because the brief was all about restoring, you know, having some homage, I think, to the natural heritage of the site, I wanted to bring a bit more to that. I was really interested in having one piece of flora that was indigenous, and then one piece of flora that was introduced. And fortunately for me, both of them are also in the landscape architecture's brief. So there's the blue flax lily, which is in the centre of that corridor, and then there's two star jasmine, which is actually like from my culture, Asian culture, invading that space. And yet when you think about it, you know, thankfully, I guess to an extent, our Indigenous community is quite tolerant to other cultures being there. But this is where the here and now, you know what I mean, that we're living in some level of peaceful coexistence. And so that, to me, I mean, that was what was important to bring to that site. But I think that they were just, I mean, I don't know, you have to ask them from the council, but to a large extent they were living in aesthetics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A question from you in the audience in a moment. If you have a question, throw your hands in the air like you just don't care. Oh, small laugh. Little one. We'll get there, don't you worry. Loretta, we've just been talking about placemaking, and I'm throwing it down to you at the end. And you were saying that it's pretty difficult to signpost a community's cultural aspirations when it comes to public art. What makes this a challenge?
I don't know if I can answer that. It seems to me that public art in itself, the idea of putting art out into the public arena, is somehow, it symbolises that society's reached a certain level of sophistication, that they perceive that it's important to do so in a defined and kind of sanctioned manner. So I'm going to have a very hard time with this.
Fong can weigh in.
Yes, wade in.
Anybody can weigh in.
Anybody can wade in.
Well, who do you please? I suppose at the end of the day, you can't please everyone. So I pitch it back to everybody here. Do you please yourself as an artist, or a viewer, or the council? I don't think it's possible to answer that question.
Okay. Loretta, you wanted to continue?
No,
Richard, what do you think?
I'll
Good.
throw a spanner in.
Do it.
I'm hearing a lot of this sort of very worthy motherhood statements about placemaking, which I firmly kind of don't believe in at all. I mean, really, public art has a great role to play as a provocation, and also extended into a way of renegotiating public space in cities. So it has a terribly difficult job to do, because once you put something from a gallery into public space, or from a gallery practice into public space, it is of the size and of the annoyance value that the public can absolutely get hold of. I mean, I've had sculptures put up. The first thing I did in Parramatta when I was only in my 20s, I had to have minders where people would stand on the outside saying, "Get out of that, I'm going to bust your head for this thing." And that's what makes public art so
Because they
interesting.
hated what you
They hated
said,
what I was
right?
doing. So the thing is, placemaking comes over time. If you add something, you can work with context beautifully, or you can work making context. The fact is, if the people can come to recognise the qualities of that work, can grow with that work, and it stays as part of the memory of that place, it is genuinely placemaking. But you find the best of it is antagonistic in the start. It has to be antagonistic.
So what are some
All this
examples?
stuff about, I mean, sorry.
What are some examples? Give me some pictures here. For me,
My work is always
It's
antagonistic.
true.
I have things moved from Macquarie Street to outside the gallery to you name it. But that to me only means that I'm actually doing something worthy of entering the conversation, entering the equation of public space. Because public space in the capitalist system is the other of, it's a continual fight, pushing capitalism back to gain more public space. That's why my project now is very much about making public art that tries to extend public space. The site for me is the skin of architecture itself. I want to extend and make connections in architecture that three-dimensionalise public space. That'll really piss people off.
Yeah.
So we're just getting back to this thing of the problems of public art. In essence, we have a real problem putting any art in public space, because art usually goes in the white cube. And the white cube is this magical machine, the gallery, which recontextualises what you think in relation to the last 150 years of Western art. And so I can screw up a piece of paper, I can throw it in the corner, and it'll mean something to be read in relation to art povera and maybe performative, what have you. If I screw up a piece of paper and throw it in the street, it means nothing. So naturally you have to shift up, and you should not, as Vito Conchi always points out, you should not enter the public art equation unless you are keenly political. And I don't think making things that look like the flowers of the area or what have you, or trying to sort of lullaby people does any good.
Don't you think there's a place for both, though? I think you can have your provocations, and I think you can be antagonistic, but surely there is room for both.
Absolutely, but both will antagonise. I've made a number of pieces which are deeply contextual, and they're really meant to be, even like the memorial to the Corvette ships of Garden Island. I've seen people weep at that thing, which really moved me. But there are other times where something else is appropriate, so we can't fool ourselves. The power, we have to engage with the power of the antagonism. People are really going to get pissed off.
Okay, come on, Wendy, what do you think? Engaging with the power of the antagonist when it comes to public art.
I love it that you do it. I often get responses to my work that it's so peaceful. It's not agitating.
But is that not okay for it to be that as a legitimate response as you know?
I think there's a role for all sorts of work out in public place. I have not been interested in gallery space. I haven't pursued practice of gallery practice because I like that public space. I like exactly the kind of
You speak in the microphone before we
sorry. Yeah. But I like this thing that it agitates in some way. And I think even some of my things, my own work does agitate.
It can agitate and be soft though. If you think of the bridge between the Tate Modern and St Paul's, Anthony Caro and the architects. Now people really were pissed off about that, weren't they? And yet it's a beautiful thing. In the end, it becomes context. But to start with, you remember when it wobbled and what have you. So there's always some antagonism, even when your boats would be the same. Pissed off no matter what.
Okay, so Warren Langley, what's your thoughts?
Well, on any building site, because you're quite often the last people on the site, the most common response, usually from the other workers, is, "What's this shit?"
Yeah.
Closely followed by, "How much that cost?" So, it will always be a cost. It will always be settled. A lot of things then go on by default to be quite loved. But we have to realise that with public art, it has to be responded to by the broadest cross-section of the community. So first and foremost, it has to be a visual response. And for 90% of the people who go on to view that art, they will never have any idea what was going on in the artist's mind when they created that work.
I don't think it has to be just visual. Some of my most favourite works
initially a visual response, and then hopefully people will then peel away the layers and they will get to understand what it's about and they will, address those other issues. But first and foremost, public art will always be a visual hit.
So you don't want to just blend in the background. It has to have a moment, a reason for being there. That's the point.
Absolutely.
Okay. So when does that not work in the public realm? And I always think of this, it's a pretty obvious example, but Richard Serra's Tilted Arc that was placed in Chicago, is that right? Yeah, I know. Well, no, in New York, he placed this very large, huge steel barrier basically in the middle of this open space in front of an office tower and just blocked off the access for everybody. Really gave everybody the willies. That's antagonistic.
Sorry, then I'll shut up.
Okay, one more.
It's one of the, even though I'm not a minimalist modernist, I rejected that in my training. It's when Serra made Tilted Arc and put it downtown New York, blocking the piazza, he made the greatest public artwork that we've ever seen. Why? Because he was saying, yes, I am making you, he was making the space a subject of the work. So he was reconfiguring the city. So people had to walk around it. People really got the shits. But, and now I would imagine that the New Yorkers would actually want it back, knowing how valuable Serra's are. But he made a very cogent point, and we must never forget it as public artists, that we have the power to actually start to reshape public space, to rethink cities. And it's not about being arrogant, it's about actually, it's about taking it on. And most of the time, I still reckon you can piss people off in the community. But in the main, I think if you start to have a conversation with them, they really come on side. The enemy is always within. I started out an architect. I'm an architect artist for my sins. My enemies are my jealous architect friends. And now that I'm 60 and they have some power, they're really fucking me up. But only because I spent a lot of time saying what I thought of them and naming names.
Okay, let's talk though about, we'll get to some great examples in a moment, but maybe Suzie and Andy, we haven't heard from you in a moment. Richard did say it's reshaping public space, reshaping the urban environment. How do you approach that in your work? Why is that kind of idea quite pivotal when it comes to public work, as opposed to what you do in your private practice?
It's the idea of, to me, it's the idea of looking at a space that might be unremarkable and attempting to make it remarkable. I really like that idea. I like the idea that having done that, that people might, the audience might stumble upon it accidentally. You know, it might be a tradesman sort of driving past, or that the audience actually is someone who might never cross the threshold of an art gallery. And the idea that the work, having activated the space, over time might become the subject of conversation between people. You know, people would sort of start to identify, if it's a shocking thing, a controversial thing, a provocative thing, that it might generate a dialogue between those that had seen it across a city or across a suburb, whether they're, no matter what their cultural background or their age, and I think that's what you can hope to do, if you crack it. But I think there are plenty of examples of works that fail to do that,
I'd love some examples of work that have failed to do that.
And I think that the hard thing that we have to work with is the idea that humans become blind really quite quickly. In the same way that a hot news story becomes retreats, it becomes yesterday's news. I think an artwork in a street with people walking past day after day can easily and quickly become invisible.
So you mean it just becomes a piece of the furniture, just decorative?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, but there are moments when that's okay though, surely.
But that's just for the people that are walking by every day, and there's always, plenty of instances, I'm sure, where people for the first time are walking down that street, and that can happen for years, of course. So,
what are some of those bad examples, Andy?
I'm trying to sort of focus on good examples.
Oh, let's have some bad ones and some good ones.
We'd have to name works made by friends of ours. I'm not really maybe Richard would like to speak.
I think I have an example perhaps that we might be able to talk about briefly, and I think this artist is fantastic, but I think that the work, and it's a famous public artwork that we all know, is not successful, and it's poo on sticks, okay? Ken Unsworth's Stones Set Against the Sky, I think that's what it's called. Amazing artist. Who could talk then, therefore, about that collaboration between the client and the artwork? I bet you can. Okay, Richard, here we go.
I don't want to dominate. No, well, Ken's a friend, so I can say we've all said to Ken that's a fuck up, Ken. That really
it really isn't.
Now the thing is, though,
actually, just quickly on that note,
Ken is really the.
I was going to say that it actually became a better artwork when the developer who bought the building that it's next to, he painted it grey, made it better.
One of the things that Ken didn't do, but it's complicated with Ken, because Ken is he's our greatest living sculptor and performance artist. He did the balancing stones in the art gallery on the wires, and he does have this tendency though to move from real material, like the stones, from the river stones hanging, to fake materials, because his performance, if you know it, is very kind of vaudeville, sort of 20s, 30s, interesting echo of his past and his former wife's past. But with the poo on sticks, what happened was, it's a lousy site. I mean, that's a wound in the city. there's a knife blade cut between Darlinghurst and the Cross, leaving a void into which anything that goes is going to be ridiculed. Funny podium leading to nowhere. On it goes his scene.
And it's a
he misread, and he gets pissed off at architects. He really hates them. He was done over. He thinks about the Vietnam Memorial, and he said, look, I want to balance these stones. Now, if the engineers kind of turned him down, and the council, everyone started to interfere, and he walked away. So if they'd allowed the columns to be, expensive enough to hold real stones that are pivoted in, like it's quite a, rather than hollow, their sort of cement shell. So he admits that he walked away at that point of its realisation. Now, no matter how bad that space is, all I'll argue is, if, as an artist, I had seen those columns properly made and those real river stones somehow uncannily floating like clouds, it is unswervable.
It'd be beautiful.
So this is a moment where you can never leave a public artwork until the last nail, you have to be in control of it.
Pamela, you have a story about an artwork where a developer took over and you didn't put your name to it in the end, is that right?
Oh, yeah,
Is that moment where it's similar to this kind of story, possibly not as infamous as that one?
No, because, I'm not, nobody can see I'm probably like a generation below. I've studied some of these artists at university.
I'm just upset.
And that anonymity gives you a little bit of freedom. But when I was a little bit younger, I actually, a friend of mine at the time, she was a friend, was the project manager, and I was selected for something up in Queensland. And she was really quite, how to put it, like, quite forceful in wanting to help manage the fabrication of it. And I had a team already that had go to similar work somewhere else. And I was like, okay, but she really wanted to do it. So much so that early on there was a real conflict because she wanted me to separate from the fabricator I normally used, and then she wanted to appropriate that approach, which early on it became really dangerous because instead of having, she wanted to put like one layer of glass in, and instead it was actually a veneer. So what would have happened was that like a balcony, if you can imagine balustrade, people would have fallen through and died. So what happened? Which is unfortunate
for an artist.
And I caught her up on that, and that was a hugely destructive process for our relationship. And after then onwards, and I got in a lot of trouble. I was really young at this time. I said, okay, you can do. I let her do a lot of the things, and I was flying back and forth to other commissions overseas at the time. And she was the one who's saying, look, she would sign off on the files, and she went into the place where they fabricated the glass, and she signed off saying it looks brilliant. They put it on a wall, and then she sent me an image. Look, Pamela, they finished it, and I nearly fell off my chair when I opened the file because it was not only backwards, like inverted to where it was supposed to be shaded and the other area was clear, so it was completely inverted because it was supposed to be providing some shade or something like that. And some of it was upside down. It was already all embedded into the wall. So
it was wrong.
It was wrong, but it was embedded in the wall, like screwed in.
And you couldn't change it. So this is like a worst case scenario.
Oh, it would be like thousands of dollars to go and correct it, to rip it out. And the irony of it is that the client loved it. Like, and there are projects that I at the time was really fighting to get sign off, for that I thought that they were hugely impractical, huge plastic things or whatever that just didn't. But the client really loved this, and I just said, look, I hate it. I don't want anything to do with it. It was a huge problem because the council at that time paid for it. They wanted me to stand in front of a big photo.
So did you get your name on it at the end?
I just took it off.
Yeah, okay. So that sounds like a worst case scenario. Let's have some questions from you. We've got some pretty extraordinary artists here. So if you have a question, hands up. Thank you, at the back.
I've got a question for Warren, and it's about the work here at the Concourse. I think it's an interesting example of public space because it's within the enclave of the building, but of course it's highly visible outside of the building within what we would perhaps conventionally consider the public space. And I'm interested to know how you initially approached the work, given the unique nature of the public space that you're working in.
I think with any public artwork, or any people who are working in this genre, you are straddling the boundary between art, architecture and engineering. It's very, very different to any other art arena that I can think of. This was a huge void with a limited budget, so I had to address a large voluminous architectural space, but most importantly was the through view from the outside of the building was important. So all of that was taken into account. But then again, in that peeling away the layers of meaning beneath, it's about movement. It's about that rush to the cinema door when the final bell goes. So there's a very simple narrative in there as well. But first and foremost, it was about addressing the architectural space. And that's, I guess, what I'm talking about when I say that the brief should always be for the artist to simply address the site. And how you choose to address it, by addressing the cultural issues of the past, whether it's previous usage or whatever, is another thing. But address the space, and that was the approach I took to that work there.
And the colour?
Light blue.
Which is apparently the most favoured colour no matter where you are in the world, except one country where they prefer red. I can't tell you who that is. Loretta and Fong, Warren just was talking about, I suppose, the importance of the architectural space and getting to know the site really well. How does that work for you? I mean, at what point do you think, for example, if it's a new development, you could either say, I've got, $1 million to deal with art right at the end of the process, and I was required to by law, or should I be brought in early? What's your thoughts on this?
Sometimes it's good to be brought on early, I think, so you can actually influence what is actually drawn down on paper, and you can have dialogue with the architects and engineers and so forth. But other times I think it's better to have limitations, I think. Every job's different. I think it's really up to that particular job that you're going in for. As for us, I think we normally come in with a couple of ideas anyway. One that's usually very radical that we like to push, and then others that are more conservative that you might sell the idea to that sort of thing. So we come in armed.
Do you know those that where you've got those three ideas and you make the one that you really want seem less important, you put that at the bottom?
Yeah.
No, you don't want that one.
No. It's a game.
Suggestion.
Yeah, it is a suggestion.
Loretta, your thoughts?
Yes, I as much as I sort of imagine, I'll sometimes think, it'd be great to have this unfettered, this space, unlimited budget and all of these things. I know from my own experience in my private practice that constraints usually produce the best outcome. I'm really forced to push against these and think about how, I can make the most of it. And so I think the same thing operates in the public space. That, I'm more like a child in the candy store. I'm better off if I've just got the choice between the cobbler and the minty or something. But when it's a whole lot, I don't operate very well. And I believe that Fong is the same way. That by and large, it's better to have a lot of the stuff that really doesn't concern us, frankly, as artists. Sorted out, but we have worked on projects, and we're currently working on one where we've been brought in at the ground level with everyone on board, and that's been extremely rewarding because we have actually been able to work very nicely together and strangely enough come to a consensus that was, in the beginning all our ideas were very similar. It was quite remarkable, so.
But it isn't always smooth sailing, because there's always egos involved with it, so, and there's always clashes of egos. So.
I know what that's like. Don't you worry.